Hello, it's Elizabeth Busby here, and welcome to Discerning Marriage. Today we are going to be talking about a topic a little bit different than what we typically talk about when it comes to like dating and marriage and those sorts of things. We're going to be talking about anxiety. This is the sort of thing that in this day and age, quite a few people struggle with. And as a clinician, a licensed marriage and family therapist, I thought maybe I would kind of broadly add to this conversation and give you guys some tips to get you started in working through your own anxiety if this is something you struggle with. So at the beginning of this conversation, I need to make a distinction between like clinical diagnosable anxiety disorders and anxiety, right? A lot of times we kind of think of them synonymously, and perhaps in the past, they either were synonymous or there wasn't enough research to like tease out the two. But in this day and age, currently, there are two separate distinctions. One of them means that your brain is functioning differently than a healthy brain typically functions. When a person experiences some sort of stress in their body, a stressful situation externally or something in their mind that feels really stressful, what's called your sympathetic nervous system clicks on, okay? That is the part of your body that is responsible for things like fight or flight. So your body starts dumping adrenaline and cortisol, et cetera, other things too, into your bloodstream. That's when you start to experience sweaty palms, heart racing, like those tingly limbs, like those sorts of sensations. And you have to engage what's called the parasympathetic nervous system in order to calm your body back down, right? To bring your heart rate back to its resting state, to tell your brain that you're not in danger. It calms your body down. Some people's bodies, some people's brains are extra sensitive. So because of trauma, because just their brain was wired differently. This is how the fall manifests in the fall of man manifests in their body, right? Now that sin and death has entered the world, this is just how their body has experienced that for a myriad of reasons, lots of them. Their sympathetic nervous systems are extremely sensitive. So they are on what I kind of affectionately call a cortisol drip. Like they are in a place where their brains are just much quicker to go into that sympathetic nervous system's like state. They're extra sensitive to having the cortisol, the adrenaline, et cetera, pumped into their bodies. They are just much more heightened. For other people who struggle with clinical anxiety, their parasympathetic nervous system does not calm them down as quickly or as efficiently as a healthy brain or healthy body would. So maybe they get stress, their sympathetic nervous system turns on at a rate that's a little bit more typical, but their parasympathetic nervous system is not as good at calming them down. So you have these two situations. If that is you, if you are in a place where clinically, biologically, your body is not functioning at the level of a healthy, normal body, the only way to really treat that is by a medical approach. Going to a therapist. You can do a talk therapy. You can do an EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a trauma intervention that helps to use the body's natural healing mechanisms to calm the body down, to heal the body. You can do something like a neurofeedback, which is the sort of biological intervention that reprograms the brain's synaptic firing to function in a more healthy way. You can go to a psychiatrist and do things like medication, right? Some people's bodies really just need the kind of medication that will calm their brains down and get them to a baseline. Anytime I talk about medication, I get pushback from people, which I think is really silly because if you have a type 1 diabetic who is a person that their pancreas does not produce the right amount of insulin, which is something that regulates your blood sugar and is necessary for survival, and you supplement with insulin, no one would look at them and be like, don't take the insulin, just try and figure it out, right? There's type 2 diabetes, which is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the type 1 diabetes where your pancreas just cannot do it because that's the way the fall manifests in your body. You would never look at that person and ridicule them for supplementing what their body doesn't create already. But in mental health, there's a huge stigma around using proper medication to get your brain functioning the way a healthy person's brain ought to function. And it drives me bonkers because people who need medication aren't getting it because of the stigma, which drives me nuts. There are people who over-medicate and who use medication as a Band-Aid to not actually do the work, or they're not actually clinically anxious, but they use it as though they were. Those aren't the people I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people whose brains and bodies have malfunctioned and they need medication to get them to a baseline. So just talk to your doctor about medication if you think that might be you. Now, for all the rest of you, if I had to say how many people struggle with the kind of anxiety that like the Bible talks about with have no anxiety at all, and how many people struggle with the kind of biological anxiety that they actually just have a biological malfunction and need support in that, I would say it is much more on this side, right? But I have to talk about it clinically because people who actually have disorders of their brains aren't getting the help that they need because they think they can just like pray it away and take like the Bible's advice for them, and it doesn't work for them, and it's frustrating, and that's why. Okay, but now we're talking about the people who don't have a clinical anxiety disorder, and they just are struggling with the kind of anxiety that the have no anxiety at all in Scripture can overcome for you. So now we're going to talk about that. If you do not have a clinical anxiety disorder, and you are struggling with anxiety, what it's important for you to know is that anxiety comes when you are thinking about things that are outside of your control. Fear or worry comes when there's like something that like a decision you have to make or something going on in your present day and you need to figure out how to relate to that, right? And navigate it. But anxiety comes when you are looking at a situation that you just feel like you have no control over. And the vast majority of the time, that anxiety comes when we're either looking at the future, and to be frank, the future is a fantasy land. The future does not exist. We are not promised tomorrow. We are not promised the next hour. We have no idea what's going to happen next. But we treat the future as though it is as tangible and real as the present, and that is a problem because we can control the present to some extent. We can control some things. We can control, if nothing else, we can control how we respond to the present and what our behavior and our mood is. But we can never control the future because the future does not exist. It is just an imagined state. So when you're anticipating the future and thinking about the future, almost always you'll get some sort of anxiety because it's stuff outside of your control because it's not happening yet, right? The other time when we have a lot of anxiety is when we're trying to control things outside of our control, like somebody else's free will, like somebody else's choices, even someone that we love very dearly, like the person that we're dating or our spouse or our parents or our kids or whatever. And we find ourselves in a situation where we're trying to control what is in someone else's locus of control and thinking that we can control it. So in those instances where we have just a lot of this like kind of underlying anxiety about these situations, the first piece of advice I want to give you is to be aware of what it is you're ruminating on. Ruminating is the clinical term for like thinking over something over and over. So what are you ruminating on? Is it something that is in your control? Because probably the answer is no. And if you can recognize that it is not in your control, then the first thing you do in that situation is work to surrender, okay? So in Scripture where Paul says, have no anxiety at all, but in all things with prayer and petition and thanksgiving, make your requests known to God, then the peace of Christ, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. That's in Philippians chapter 4. When you process that and you apply that to your life, what Paul is talking about doing is taking a custody of your mind right after that verse. I'm pretty sure that's verse like 6 and 7. And then verse 8 is the whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is noble, whatever is just, whatever is blah, 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 whatever those are. Think about these things. What he's trying to tell you is that you have control over where your mind goes. If you don't have control over where your mind goes and you can't think about it, you're probably in this like clinical disorder camp. Probably. Most likely. But the vast majority of people who don't have clinical disorders can control where your mind goes. It takes a lot of practice, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of work, but you are capable of doing it. And you need to work on recognizing what you let yourself think about and what you let yourself ruminate on. So the analogy that I always give people is a big wheat field, okay? So when you think about a wheat field, it's like all these stalks of wheat that are tall. And if you're wanting to go from point A to point B in the wheat field and you walk through the wheat field, one walkthrough is going to like suppress the wheat when you're walking, and then it's going to pop right back up because it's used to being up. If you walk from point A to point B over and over, like back and forth and 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 back and forth, that wheat is going to be trampled down. So a person standing at the front of the wheat field is going to see exactly where you walked, and it's going to be like the path of least resistance. So that's where the person's going to go, most likely. The same is true with our brains and what's called synapses, which are the connections between two different points in our brain. When you have a synapse that's been activated by thinking over and over and over about this thing, you're basically walking back and forth across that synapse. So your brain is going to more naturally think down that path, okay? A lot of times when we have fostered or held space for, if you will, these anxious thoughts, these ruminations about things that are outside of our control, the future, somebody else's choices, etc., we're going back and forth and over that path. And so the wheat is trampled, and that's where your brain's naturally going to go. If you want to make changes and follow St. Paul's advice and think about whatever is noble and true and good and have no anxiety at all, right? Which the key to having no anxiety is thinking in the present moment about the things that you can control and being open to God's grace, which is what I'll address in a few minutes. If you want to cultivate that habit, what it's going to take is not letting your brain go down the wheat path that it's been down before, but instead go down a different one. It is a lot of work to develop that kind of custody of your mind because your mind wants to go down the synapse that it's been going down before instead of going down a new one and then making that one the one that you walk back and forth and press all the wheat down. And over time, that path is the one that's going to be more readily accessible because the wheat has been trampled down. And this path, maybe it will grow back to be less accessible. So that's number one, making sure that you are taking custody of your mind and making sure that you are being mindful of what you think about and not thinking about the ruminations. The second thing I want to do is like basic human thriving things, okay? When therapists talk about this sort of thing, people roll their eyes, but they shouldn't, because these are the sort that God set our bodies up for success, and we should just do what our bodies want. Like get extra sleep, right? Make sure that you're sleeping like 7 to 8 hours a night. And I'm talking like good quality sleep, not like I've been on my phone for 3 hours right before I go to bed and then I lay in my bed, but my mind is racing because I've bombarded it with information and blue light and haven't gotten time to calm down. No, make sure that you are getting good quality sleep with good quality sleep hygiene before you go to bed. It's probably outside the scope of this talk to talk about sleep hygiene, but go ahead and Google it. It's very helpful. Make sure that you're eating nourishing food, okay? Nourishing things like protein and vegetables and fruits and carbohydrates, right? Make sure that you're eating healthy in a healthy way. Make sure you don't drink a lot of caffeine. A lot of people know or jokingly like reference the fact that caffeine is addictive, but it is actually addictive. And not only is it addictive, it is a chemical and a substance that like mimics anxiety in your body, basically. So if you are really struggling with anxiety, cut caffeine. I know that's going to seem like I'm your least favorite person in the entire world, but it's true. If you are trying to figure out how to manage your anxiety, start by cutting out the things that make you more anxious biologically, like caffeine. And make sure you're getting outside and make sure you're moving. So there's so much research on the power of the sun, like the beauty of the sun and the way that the sun affects our bodies. Go outside. If you are feeling anxious, literally just like go outside. If you're in a place where it's really rainy, that's kind of tricky, but see if you can save up your pennies and fly to somewhere that's sunny. And obviously that's not something you can do like every day, but it seriously is something that will make a big difference, is being in the sun and exercise. So moving your body. A lot of times when we get anxious, the human response is just to like continue curling up on your couch and be like scrolling something to like make your mind numb. No. Put your phone down. Oh, that's my last piece of advice. Put your phone down, okay? What's going on the internet, whether it's in the news, whether it's on social media, whatever it is you're consuming, probably is outside of your control. So it's going to make you feel anxious because you can't, the vast majority of us are not called to be in Congress and actually make these changes, right? We can vote and that's responsible and we need to like educate ourselves so we can make a good vote. But the vast majority of you are not going to be actually called by God to make the changes. So spending a lot of your time and energy ruminating on those things. It's an election year, so it's hot on everyone's mind right now, even though you may be watching this at another time. But you know what? In America, there's always an election coming up at some point. So the idea that we feel like we can control and change a lot of things, but God hasn't called us to do that, is something that can cause a lot of anxiety because you're thinking about something outside of your control. So making sure that what you're consuming is good for your brain. And if it's not, cut off social media until you get your anxiety under control, right? And go outside. Take the time that you were on social media to go outside and do something energetic. Get some friends together and play Ultimate Frisbee and try to do that like 2 or 3 times a week if you can. Or maybe go on a walk or I don't know, go for a swim, those sorts of things. Make sure that you're being active. So those are my basic tips for managing anxiety that is not a clinical diagnosis. It is just a circumstantial life situation that has set you up for anxiety. It is amazing to me how the introduction of social media and the prominence that social media holds in the lives of a lot of people have corresponded to what clinically we say like correlation, but not causation. So there's a strong correlation between how intense social media has gotten and how people's anxiety and depression has raised up. And in the next, I would imagine in the next decade or so, we're going to see even more research coming out that will show that there very likely is a causation between social media consumption and anxiety because of this whole lack of control thing. I think maybe that's too simplistic, but I'm going to say it anyway. So if we are in a situation where you are feeling a lot of anxiety, I highly recommend you put these practices into play. I think I'm also going to say one last thing, and that is going to be to up your prayer life. Make sure that you are going to the sacraments of Mass and confession. Make sure that you are in a state of grace and make sure that you're spiritually as healthy as you can be so that you have the resources to emotionally battle and physically battle some of these anxieties. So I hope that this is helpful. Obviously, there's lots more information out there by people who have clinical pages, like people whose total audience is on psychology and those sorts of things and living a psychological life. But as the Theology of the Body Institute to live holistic, beautiful lives, and because I am a clinician, we thought that it would be helpful to have something on our page to talk to you guys about anxiety. So I hope this was beneficial for you. And if you want to see more of this kind of stuff, leave a comment. We look at all of our comments and we take your opinions into consideration when we're making these videos. So until next time, stay close to the heart of Jesus and be not afraid. Bye.